The frost crunched like shattered glass under her boots, every step a brittle announcement in the quiet. Hay dust hung in the weak December sun, slicing through the stable's high windows, motes dancing in beams that felt cold despite the light. The air smelled of damp earth, old wood, and the sharp, clean scent of horses, a smell that now carried the weight of an unanswered question. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is the wild creature they left behind? Sarah stopped just inside the big sliding door, letting the chill seep through her worn jacket. Her brother's jacket, the one he wore mending fences, the one that still faintly held the ghost of his sweat and cheap aftershave beneath the smell of leather oil. The stable was vast, echoing. Empty stalls yawned like dark mouths down the long aisle, except one at the far end, where he was. She hadn't wanted to come. Not today, not ever, maybe. The lawyer's words still echoed, part of the estate, Sarah, he specifically requested. But they felt hollow against the raw ache in her chest. Mark was gone. 3 months gone in a skid of tires on wet asphalt. And all that remained, tangibly him, was this animal. This piece of untamed landscape Mark had somehow coaxed into his life. A Mustang. She forced her legs to move. The sound of her own breathing seemed too loud. The only other sounds were the soft sigh of wind finding cracks in the old timbers, and the distant, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a heavy body shifting weight against wood, coming from his stall. As she drew closer, the air changed. Less hay, more musk. The scent of sun-baked rock and dry grass, even in winter. She saw the top of his head first, above the stall door. Dark, tangled forelock falling over one eye. Then, as she reached the bars, the whole of him. He stood facing the back wall, a silhouette of raw power barely contained. Not massive like a draft horse, but dense. Muscles coiled under a rough, dun-colored coat scarred with the pale lines of old battles fought under an open sky. His mane was thick, matted in places, falling over a neck thick with crest. He didn't turn, didn't flick an ear. He simply was. A statue carved from wilderness and set down in this sterile human place. The stillness radiating from him wasn't peace. It was waiting, a coiled spring wrapped in hide and bone. Sarah's breath hitched. This wasn't a horse. This was a storm barely banked. Mark's final, complicated gift. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal of the stall door. The chill bit her skin. Stupid, she thought. What am I even doing here? Selling him felt like a betrayal. Keeping him felt like inviting a lightning strike into her already shattered life. She traced, a scratch on the metal with a trembling fingertip. The silence stretched, thick with her unshed tears and the horse's profound indifference. Then a shift, almost imperceptible. The rhythmic thumping stopped. The muscles along his near flank tensed just for a second. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt ancient, the great head turned, not fully, just enough for one dark liquid eye to fix on her. Deep brown, surrounded by thick lashes, holding an intelligence that wasn't tame, wasn't friendly, but was undeniably aware. He looked at her, through her. Sarah froze, pinned by that gaze. It held no malice, no curiosity even, just assessment. As if weighing her presence against the vast emptiness she carried inside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird. She should say something. Mark would have. He'd talk nonsense, whistle tunelessly, fill the space with his easy confidence. Sarah's throat was sandpaper. She swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet. The eye watched, unblinking. A shiver ran through her, unrelated to the cold. Days bled into weeks. Sarah came. Not every day at first, sometimes just standing outside the stall feeling the absurdity of it. Sometimes forcing herself inside, armed with a brush Mark had left behind, its wooden handle worn smooth by his grip. She'd stand near the front, well away from the horse who always stood at the back, facing the wall. She'd talk, sometimes. Halting sentences about the weather, the drive over, the numb emptiness of her apartment. Her voice sounded thin, unconvincing even to her own ears. He never reacted, just stood, a monument to silence, the only movement the slow rise and fall of his ribcage, the occasional flick of an ear catching a fly, or the sound of her voice like distant thunder. She named him Dust, for the color of his coat, for the barren landscape he came from, for the feeling that settled in her lungs since Mark died. It wasn't a name she spoke aloud, just a thought. One bitingly cold afternoon, the weak sun already fading, Sarah entered the stall. She held a curry comb, the rubber teeth stiff and cold. Dust stood in his usual spot, his back a solid, unyielding wall. She started on his shoulder. Furthest from his head, her strokes tentative, barely touching the thick winter coat. She braced for the flinch, the sidestep, the pinned ears she'd read about in library books on Mustangs. Nothing. He remained utterly still. The only sign he registered her touch was a faint tremor that ran under the skin, like a ripple across a deep, still pond. She kept brushing, moving slowly down his side, talking nonsense about the price of gas. The silence between her words felt less like a void and more like space, shared space. She reached the curve of his flank. Her arm was tired, her fingers numb. She paused, leaning her forehead briefly against the solid warmth of him. Just for a second. The heat radiating through his coat was startling, alive. She felt the massive shift of his breathing beneath her touch. Then, something changed. The air stilled. The stable sounds faded. Slowly, deliberately, Dust turned his head. Not just his eye this time. His entire head swung around on that thick neck. He looked directly at her. Not through her, at her. His nostrils flared wide, sucking in her scent. The cold air, her wool scarf, the grief she wore like a second skin. He didn't move closer, didn't lower his head. But his gaze held hers, deep and bottomless. It wasn't gentle. It was present. Utterly, completely present in that frozen moment. Sarah stopped breathing. The curry comb hung forgotten in her hand. The raw, untamed. Wildness in his eye didn't frighten her now. It felt like a reflection, a silent acknowledgement of the vast, howling emptiness she carried. He saw it. He didn't look away. She didn't know how long they stood like that. Seconds? Minutes? Time dissolved in the intensity of that shared gaze. Finally, her lungs burning, she sucked in a ragged breath. Dust blinked, slowly. Then with that same ancient deliberation, he turned his head back towards the wall, resuming his vigil. The connection severed, leaving only the echo of his heat against her chilled skin, and the profound sense that something wordless, something fundamental, had just shifted in the air between them. She finished brushing in silence, her movements automatic. The usual numbness felt different, lighter somehow, or maybe just shared. As she gathered the brush and turned to leave the stall, she hesitated. She always hesitated. This time she clicked the latch softly, the sound loud in the settling. Dusk. She took one step down the concrete aisle, then another. Behind her there was a soft snort, the scrape of a hoof on wood. She stopped, didn't turn, listened. Silence. She took another step. A soft, heavy footfall landed on the concrete behind her. Then another. She closed her eyes, held her breath. The footsteps stopped. She could feel him there, close. The warmth of his body radiated against her back. The quiet puff of his breath stirred the hair at her nape. He didn't nudge, didn't nick her. He just stood, waiting, as if the space she occupied was suddenly a place he needed to be. Sarah didn't move, didn't turn. The question hung heavy in the cooling air, thick as the scent of hay and horse and loss. Why was the wild thing, Mark, left behind, now following her into the dark? The rhythm changed. Winter's brittle grip loosened, replaced by the hesitant mud and tentative green shoots of early spring. Sarah still came. Every day. The drive to the stable, once a trek through, numbness became a quiet ritual. Dust still often stood facing the wall when she arrived, but now his ear would swivel back, tracking her footsteps down the aisle, a silent acknowledgement. The space between them wasn't empty silence anymore. It was a shared quiet, thick with something unspoken. She noticed the small things, how he'd sometimes blow softly through his nostrils when she entered the stall, a warm puff of air against the lingering chill. How his eye, when it watched her, seemed less like an assessment and more observant. Curious, perhaps, in that deep, reserved way of his. She talked more. Not forced chatter, but fragments of memory spilled into the quiet air of the stall. Mark loved mornings like this, she'd murmur, scraping mud from Dust's hooves while he stood patiently, head lowered. Said the air tasted clean. Dust would flick an ear, a slow blink, the only sign he'd heard. Then came the jacket. It was an old chore day, unseasonably warm. Sarah shed Mark's worn leather jacket, hanging it on a nail outside Dust's stall before fetching the wheelbarrow. When she returned, Dust wasn't at the back wall. He was standing near the front, his nose pressed deep into the worn leather sleeve Sarah had just removed. Not nibbling, not rubbing, just breathing in, deeply. His eyes were half closed, his entire being focused on that scent. Sarah froze, the wheelbarrow handle biting into her palms. A tremor started low in her belly. He remembered. He knew that. Scent. Mark's scent, buried deep in the leather, sweat, and oil. Dust lifted his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers. There was no wildness there now, only a profound, quiet recognition that punched the air from Sarah's lungs. He gave a soft, rumbling sigh, the sound vibrating in the quiet stable, then turned and walked slowly back to his spot. Sarah stood rooted, the world tilting. The jacket suddenly felt like a shroud. The strangeness deepened. Dust began reacting to the name Mark. Not obviously, not like a dog. But if Sarah spoke his name, even softly, while brushing, Dust's ear would snap towards her with unusual swiftness. A stillness would fall over him, different from his usual watchful calm. It was a listening stillness, an expectant stillness. One rainy afternoon, lost in thought while currying his broad back, Sarah whispered, "He'd have loved seeing you like this, Dust. Calm." At the name Mark, Dust's head swung around sharply, not just looking at her. He took a single deliberate step towards her, his muzzle reaching out, not touching, but hovering inches from her shoulder, his warm breath ghosting over her neck. His dark eyes held hers, intense, searching, as if waiting for Mark to materialize from the damp air. Sarah's hand stilled on the brush. A cold dread, mixed with a terrifying, fragile hope, began coiling inside her. It felt irrational, impossible. Yet the horse's behavior, his focused intensity on that name, on that scent, it wasn't training. It was memory. It was connection. And it was chipping away at the wall Sarah had built around her grief, brick by painful brick. The breaking point came unexpectedly, triggered by nothing grand. Just a mundane task. She was mending a section of the old paddock fence where the wood had rotted near the base. Mark had started this repair. She found his hammer, its handle worn smooth by his grip, tucked behind a stack of lumber he'd left under a tarp. The sight of it lying there forgotten, waiting for a hand that would never return. It was a physical blow. She picked it up. The weight, the shape, the ghost of his sweat ingrained in the wood. It was him. Suddenly, the dam holding back. 3 months of choked-back agony shattered. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, echoing in the quiet field. Tears, hot and relentless, blurred the budding green of the pasture. She sank to her knees in the damp earth, clutching the hammer like a lifeline, her body racked with tremors she couldn't control. The grief wasn't a wave. It was an ocean, pulling her under, drowning her in the unbearable finality of it all. Mark was gone. Truly, irrevocably gone. And she was kneeling in the mud, alone, holding the useless tool of his unfinished life. Then, warmth. Solid, breathing warmth pressed against her side. Dust. He hadn't been in the paddock. She'd left. Him in the stall. He must have pushed open the gate she'd forgotten to latch properly. He stood beside her, his massive shoulder a steady pressure against her trembling frame. He didn't nuzzle, didn't whinny. He simply stood. Close. His head lowered slightly, his warm breath stirring her hair. His presence wasn't demanding. It wasn't pitying. It was anchoring. A silent bulwark against the storm raging inside. Her. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement that pressed his warmth more firmly against her. Sarah leaned into him, her tears soaking into his thick dun coat, her sobs muffled against his solid shoulder. She cried for Mark. She cried for the future stolen. She cried for the terrifying loneliness. And Dust stood, unmoving, unflinching, his slow, steady breaths a counterpoint to her ragged gasps, his massive heart beating a quiet rhythm against her ear. He stayed. Long after the worst of the storm passed, long after her sobs subsided into shaky breaths, long after the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised colors. He stayed until the trembling stopped, until the crushing weight in her chest eased just enough to breathe without breaking. He stayed simply being there, a silent testament that she wasn't alone in the vast, aching emptiness. Weeks bled into months. Spring matured, painting the world in vibrant greens and wildflowers. The stable wasn't just a place of duty anymore. It was a haven. Sarah moved with a new ease, a quiet purpose that hadn't been there before. The numbness had receded, replaced, not by forgetting, but by a softer ache, a space where memories could live without constant, suffocating pain. She hummed sometimes while mucking stalls. She laughed once, startled, when Dust playfully lipped at her hat brim. He was different, too. The constant vigilance, the wariness etched into his posture, had softened. He met her at the stall door more often than not, ears pricked forward. He'd lower his head for the halter, a gesture that felt less like submission and more like trust. He grazed peacefully in the paddock, no longer scanning the horizon like an exile. The wild Mustang was still there, in the proud arch of his neck, in the power coiled beneath his calm. But it was tempered now, gentled. By what? By shared silence? By shared grief? By the simple, persistent act of showing up? One bright June morning, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle, Sarah opened the paddock gate. Dust ambled out, heading towards his favorite grazing spot near the old oak. But instead of stopping, he walked past it, down the gentle slope towards the creek that bordered the property. Sarah followed, curious. He rarely went this far. He stopped near the water's edge, where the willow branches trailed in the current. He lowered his head, not to drink, but to nudge something half buried in the soft earth near the bank. Sarah knelt, brushed away the damp soil and leaves. Her fingers closed around smooth, worn wood, a small, hand-carved box, Mark's work. She remembered him whittling it one lazy Sunday, complaining about the knot in the wood. She'd forgotten it existed. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, no jewels, no grand secrets, just a collection of small, ordinary things that suddenly held the weight of a universe. A smooth, river-washed stone she'd given him years ago, a faded ticket stub from their first county fair, a feather from a blue jay, and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it with infinite care, Mark's familiar messy scrawl filling her vision. Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm probably annoying angels with bad jokes. Don't be sad too long, okay? Live loud, laugh harder. Remember that blue jay feather? You said it was perfectly imperfect. That's us. That's life. Dust, he's more than a horse. He's a piece of the wild I tamed, or maybe he tamed me. He sees things, feels things. Don't underestimate him or yourself. You're stronger than you think. Thanks for putting up with me, kid. Love you always. Mark. Tears welled again, but they were different now. Not the shattering tears of loss, but the quiet, releasing tears of love acknowledged, of a message received across an impossible distance. She looked up. Dust stood a few feet away, watching her. The sunlight dappled through the willow leaves, catching the deep brown of his eyes. In that gaze, she didn't see just a horse. She saw the conduit, the wild, silent witness to her brother's spirit. Mark hadn't just left her a horse. He'd left her a guardian, a mirror, a creature who, in his own wordless equine way, had carried her through the darkest valley and led her back into the light, bearing Mark's final, whispered gift, the permission to live again, perfectly imperfect. Dust blew softly, a warm puff of air against the morning chill, and lowered his head to graze on the tender creek grass, utterly at peace. Sarah clutched the note and the feather, the river stone cool in her palm. The ache for Mark would always be there, a familiar shape inside her, but it no longer filled the whole space. There was room now for sunlight, for the scent of honeysuckle, for the quiet companionship of a once wild heart who had learned to stand beside her in the stillness. Sometimes the greatest healers don't speak a word. Sometimes they simply stand beside you in the storm, breathing slow and steady until you remember how to breathe too. And sometimes the ones who finally help you find your way back are the ones who were lost themselves. If this story of a wild Mustang and a silent child finding their voices together touched your heart, please do us a huge favor. Subscribe so you never miss our next emotional journey. Leave a comment below. Tell us what moved you most, or share your own story of unexpected healing. Hit the bell icon to get notified every time we upload a new story that might just change your day. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that healing can come on 4 quiet hooves. We pour our hearts into these true tales of resilience. Your support helps us find and share the next story waiting to be told. Thank you for being here.